Let's go ahead and jump right in because I do have quite a bit to talk to you about. I am the only one that's doing two organizational profile criteria. So let's go back to where we started and talk a little bit about the organizational profile. Again, both of these topics are in that first box on the left for your organizational environment, because what you have for assets and the regulatory environment you work in are both, your operational environment, things you need to know for your operations and things you need to consider, and not just operationally, but I'm going to be talking a lot about strategy today. If we had a drinking game going for strategy, that none of us would want to play for me saying strategy in this presentation right now. Instead, what you should do is you should write down more strategy for assets, strategy for regulatory compliance, because it's so important. So let's go start with one. We'll just hit the assets first. So, what is your purpose of your assets? It's really, I want you to look at your assets. So you're going to focus on what you have that enables you to do business, because that's exactly what an asset is. It's what enables you to do business. And it's physical, and intangible pieces of that you have in place to let you do business. It's really integral to assessing your financial health through your liquidity ratio, the debt ratio, the asset turnover ratio, return on assets. There's other ratios out there that help you also know, what your assets are doing for you and how well you're using them. But most importantly, assets need to be reviewed strategically to assess their requirements, their effectiveness, and their usefulness of those. And you need to look at it strategically because you have to understand, do I still need what I think is my best assets? Do they still meet my needs? Like right now, we have giant office buildings that are sitting empty. Is the future continuing to have a cube farm where people would sit and just take calls or do their business, or is it more we're going to change that into collaborative spaces and have people work from home when they don't need to be in the office and collaborate? Things like that are what I mean when I'm talking about thinking strategically of your assets. And innovation should also be part of your strategic view on assets. Do your innovations need adjustments to your assets? And conversely, do your assets allow for innovations to be implemented? When you're defining them, a good place to start is your balance sheet, because that's where you're going to find a lot of them listed out. You'll see the big money items, especially up there. But from that list, you're going to look at what is essential. What is I actually, something that allows me to do work versus something that just, I need to have, just to have. Like again, your office chairs, your telephones, versus your heavy equipment, versus your computer systems, maybe your data clouds. What is essential, and also what provides efficiency. Those robotic arms that are making your factory work, or maybe it's all your surgical tools. If you're in a hospital environment. But also what's often overlooked is your intangibles, such as patents, branding. Organizational culture is another one that's often overlooked. And proprietary knowledge is an intangible asset that people don't go on. People will say, oh, people are our best assets. When they say that, what they really mean is the proprietary knowledge of our people is our best asset. And that's what you should take from that. When you're documenting your assets, honestly, you're going to write it like you would for an investor, or a grant, or a fundraiser, when you're doing these. So, get into there, talk about your real estate, your buildings, what major equipment is vital to your work. Why is it important? Why is a big part of that. Like, why am I telling you about, my cube farm when I should be telling you about my collaborative space? As we go that way again, or why am I telling you about the hospital beds versus telling you about the operating rooms? That's what you have to get into. Why am I telling you about this? Because this is important, and this is why. And also, when you take it, segmented view along appropriate divisions such as products, services, or locations. Take those assets and go ahead and segment them, and it helps you see what business lines and what locations have those assets and what they allow for. So in summary, going over assets and regulatory compliance here, your assets are what allow you to do your work. Really, that's what you think of them as. Assets can be both tangible and intangible. You can tell you about your financial health and how efficient you are working. And most importantly, I'm going to keep saying this, is they need to be looking at these strategically. And, we always encourage having innovation as part of your strategy. So we'll shift gears here. And we're going to go to regulatory compliance. Understanding regulatory compliance, it's important because you need to understand what legal and regulatory environment you operate in. You need to understand what are the rules of the road that you have to abide by. You have to understand what regulatory or accrediting bodies have oversight. So who's important to you, whose rules do you have to follow, and whose can you, make sure you're in compliance with, but maybe not have to be like towing the line. You got to understand what you need to do from a legal standpoint to continue to operate. What's can you do and what can you not do? And you have to understand how a change in the regulatory landscape may affect you. Because they do change. They're usually slower to change, but they do change. And sometimes they do rapidly to emergencies. And you have to be able to change with those compliance changes. Otherwise, you'll be out of business. Right. So when you're defining regulatory compliance, what regulators have oversight of you, please list them out. It's a great way to start. If you're a hospital, you have the Joint Commission. Here in finance, I have the Securities and Exchange Commission. And the New York Bank Examiners. Also, but OSHA, especially if you're in an industrial setting. If you're having an accredited body, like if you're college, or almost all of us have EPA. As oversight of us, whether it's very small oversight or whether it's very large. It's one of those most common ones to look at. Next, when you're documenting, again, I can't say it enough, is to take a strategic view. You want to list the regulators for each of your business lines, and that's another good way to segment is along your business lines for regulation. List the federal and state agencies that had oversight of your operations, any accrediting bodies whose standards you have adopted, and include the major requirements of each of these groups when you're documenting. So that way and you might see some some overlap that you can have one process to cover both, or maybe you need separate processes when you're looking over these pieces. So in summary, for regulatory compliance, problems with regulatory compliance can lead to fines, your business being shut down, or even jail time. Regulatory compliance must be viewed at strategic level to assess how you stay in compliance. Or, and this is a big question some people try to get away from, if staying in business is worth the compliance cost, or maybe if you want to go in, when you're having innovations, innovations may not start or end at the strategic level, but you have to think about, will these innovations be in line with regulatory requirements? That's a good question. Is it worth pushing those regulatory boundaries? I work in finance, and a lot of the current generation of fintech has happened outside of finance and banking regulations. People talk to me all the time of Venmo and blockchain, but both of those happen outside of regulatory compliance. They happen in areas that weren't being goes. And what happens when, all of a sudden the bank says, you know what, Venmo, you're really a bank. You need to be in compliance with banking laws and regulations. What's going to happen to Venmo? And you have to think the same way from you. Same thing with blockchain. Blockchain was slow to be adopted in the traditional finance spaces.
Talking about training. Meeting today.
Please,
yeah. And so that's all it does.
Can we please mute? Thank you. Again, blockchain is being adopted now in finance, but it's making sure we're inside regulations as we're adopting these tools for blockchain. Some final thoughts on regulatory compliance, and assets. Assets regulatory compliance tend to get lost in the organizational profile. I'll tell you that right away. As an examiner, we tend to skip them over when we're writing up our final feedback report. But man, sometimes they're the most important pieces. Both areas have great impact on the later parts of the organizational profile, such as strategic challenges and strategic advantages and competitive position. Give you a little story here. These two hospitals that I have here are actually within 3.5 miles of each other. These are two actual hospitals. The one on the top that's fully done is Advent Health Wesley Chapel. The one below it is Baycare Wesley Chapel. In 2019, Florida, the state repealed the certificate of need requirement for hospitals and other major medical centers. So that's what allowed these two hospitals to be so close. Before, they would have not, they said, no, you need to go, a little farther away. You can't be that close to each other. You're going to cannibalize each other. But now, no, we have an open environment. And not only within 3.5 miles, but within a 7-mile stretch, you have these two hospitals and a standalone emergency center from HCA. And that's how little changes in regulatory compliance, and assets, because those are major asset outliers, can affect many other parts of the organizational profile. Your regulatory compliance is usually going to be a strategic challenge. and your assets will probably be a strategic advantage, but maybe it's the other way around sometimes also. You might have great processes for, working with your regulatory compliance, and that really helps you out and gives you the edge. And maybe, your assets are aging and you need to be able to keep them up and keep up with technology. And so again, that's where that strategic view really comes in. So, I've already got over again. People say sometimes people are greatest asset. This is good and bad. People hold intangibles like your culture and your proprietary knowledge, and they should be protected like an asset. And people never think that. It says, if people are your greatest asset, well, you better protect your people like you would an asset. You can't, but people in the end are not asset. They cannot be bought and sold. You cannot abuse them like you can cannibalize an asset for short-term gain, to use something up, at least with the same, legality. But the repercussions are far greater. That's why we cover workforce separately. So thank you. We'll go ahead and move on to the Q&A.
All right. Thank you, Anthony. Assets and regulatory compliance always make me think of audits, right? Assets being on the balance sheet, right? Financial auditors, and then regulatory compliance. But you're absolutely right. And I love the wrap up you did with the focus on, leveraging your assets and regulatory compliance to really put a different kind of strategic spin. Even the example you used in regard to Venmo, what's going to happen to Venmo? Regulatory really does impact, and it's a big thing to have your as a business leader, have your focus on maniacally on, because if you're not paying attention, maybe one of your competitors will, and it could really throw you a curveball. So yeah, really great session. I love this. Two topics that seem to be bland, but they're really not. You can't be innovative if you're constrained on assets, right? You can only do as much as what your assets will support, or do what your assets will support. So very good briefing in this topic. I love it. So I did take some summary notes. Let me run through them because, two topics, I have a few more than normal. Focus on what assets are available to enable and support your business functions. That one, I really love that one. Review assets to assess requirements, efficiency, effectiveness, and usefulness. Also consider financial health through asset ratios, as you mentioned, the ROA and others, right? Mm-hmm. Consider intangible assets as well. Things like patents and branding. Very, very important, especially branding, because it can set you apart. Consider segmenting assets by applicable divisions, products, services, or locations. Know what regulatory obligations must be satisfied to continue to operate, and how a change in that regulatory landscape will necessitate change. Also, AKA impact a strategy. And then only two more bullets. Like the efficiency and effectiveness of asset management, regulatory compliance can also impact an organization's sustainability and financial ratios. Consider assets and regulatory requirements when analyzing and establishing strategic or innovative objectives, and consider strategic challenges, strategic advantages, and competitive positioning. And I love that wrap up again. I really like that wrap up. You can see there are a bunch of different hospitals coming, they're just sprouting left and right. And so you really highlighted that in the wrap up. Nice job.
Especially the departments. They're coming up everywhere where I am and here in Tampa, emergency department left and right.
Yeah, and I'm in Jacksonville, St. Augustine area, and there's one down every street now. It's crazy, really. So, it's good. You can get to medical assistance pretty quickly, but what is it doing to the competitors, competitive landscape in the area and your competitors? A couple of questions we'll do. What is a type of asset that is frequently overlooked or not considered?
It's the intangibles. Almost always, people don't think of the intangibles, or they don't think of them enough. How much people talk about branding? Well, branding is an intangible asset. They'll talk about all your processes for your branding and making sure your branding's out there, all the money that's flowing in, but then they don't think of it as an asset. They get, either, I don't know if they just think of it as a sink or they think of it as something else, but that's an important asset, to go along. And other pieces like your organizational culture, people don't think of as an asset, but if you have a strong organizational culture, it might be a culture of innovation, which will be a huge asset to you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Can you provide an example of how assessing asset composition led to a surprising outcome?
Sure. And you know what? I'm going to call back to my good friend Gordon, who spoke a few weeks ago. Gordon gave us the great example of looking at the the income statements for I believe it was a gas station that actually wasn't really a gas and service station. It was really a video rental company that just happened to have a gas and service station attached to it. And really, that's what it is when you look at your asset composition. Is sometimes you'll see that your biggest asset allocation doesn't always go to your most profitable lines or most valuable lines, and that's where you have to have that strategic thought of, is it important that I'm having this strong in assets here for this? Maybe it's yes, maybe to meet regulatory compliance you just need to, or maybe not. So that's where you really you have those surprises come in.
I love that, bringing it back to Gordon, because I like that story he told as well. Can you provide an example of asset influence in strategic planning, either as a challenge, an advantage, or a competitive position?
Sure. It comes down to it. Sometimes you making those places, and again, innovation I think goes in there. But seeing those two hospitals by each other, and here you have like big asset outliers, and they need to, it's going to lead to a little bit to an arms race. So sometimes you need to take a look at that. Listen, the hospital down the street for me, well, they just put in so much money into maybe a NICU. And he says, do you know what? I don't have one. Do I want one, or do I want to send it to my sister hospital down the street? So that way, I'm not, we're not competing on something that's highly, volatile, and something that, may not have the bang for the buck we need. Let them specialize in that, and we'll go to something else going on, sometimes like that. And, or maybe you're looking through your assets and saying, is this asset still doing what I want it to do? Is it still, meeting the needs of me, my customers, my employees? And you know what? At that point, it becomes a strategic challenge to keep that asset up to date.
Mm-hmm. Right. Absolutely. All right. One more question. What would you look for to determine if your asset structure needs to be changed?
Again, you're going to go to your strategy, and you're going to look to are these assets meeting my needs? What need, what about these assets are not meeting my needs? What about these assets are, and I can, maybe even leverage even more? What, and when you look through that, you might see that, I need to have a new hospital. Maybe I need to build a brand new one down the road and, scrap this one, repurpose it to something else. Sometimes you're going to look at your assets and you're going to say, do you know what? Maybe I need to restructure my processes around these assets to better utilize them. So it really is. It's why it's so important to take the strategic view of your assets, and of course your regulatory compliance.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you, Anthony. This has been very, very helpful and insightful. Just as a reminder to our participants, don't forget, check in at floridasterling.com or thesterlingcouncil.com. After today's session, you'll be able to access the summary notes there. There should also be a link in the chat window for you to access the summary notes. The video will be posted to YouTube by tomorrow. Join us on March 29th at 12:15. We will have a leadership briefing on identifying and stratifying your customers, market segments, and stakeholders by Sterling Master Examiner Debbie Voss, also Corporate VP of Quality Initiatives, Patient Care EMS Solutions. And feel free to join us next week as well for a replay of Anthony's presentation at noon sharp. And until then, we'll see you next week, and have a happy week ahead.